This is the Nate the Voluntarist live stream, episode 23. This is a huge special because all of my guests here are Agorism, and I also have a special guest joining me today. He happens to be Gary Chartier. So, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. I wish I would be able to get Samuel Adler Konkin III on, but unfortunately he's been dead for, I believe, 15 years.
Great way to start the show.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Very macabre, but okay.
I'm sorry. But at least Gary was willing enough to come on and carry on the legacy of SEK 3. So thank you for doing that. And so with that being said, let's go ahead and introduce ourselves, not just to the audience, but to Gary as well. So Heartless, you were able to get Gary onto my show, so I'll let you go first.
Oh, hi everyone. So my name is Heartless Soy Boy. I'm 15. Yeah, I became an anarchist in a very young age. First I called myself an Ancap. Then I just read Gary Chartier's work and Samuel Edward Konkin, and I call myself now an individualist anarchist, or agorist, or free market anarchist. Yeah, that's my story.
All right, Esso.
My username on YouTube is Esoteric the Free, but people refer to me as Esso because it's a lot easier. I started off as an Ancap YouTuber, as I already mentioned to you, but as I started actually learning a bit more, about narrative structures and political concepts which don't have any grasp on philosophy, I became increasingly concerned with labels such as capitalism or socialism, mainly because of their seemingly intended application of encompassing so many broad complex ideas and labeling them under the same term, because that would deprive people of the ability to discuss philosophy. So I tend to stick towards the label free market anarchism, and I don't know if like Gary Chartier, I'd consider myself, I'd go along with the anti-capitalist labeling, but I'd more or less reject the term capitalism because it doesn't have firm etymological grounds to be used in politics. It's basically just a buzzword. But yeah, I make essays on libertarianism and philosophy. Particularly, I've been doing a lot on media analysis lately.
All right. I am Nate the Voluntarist. I'm the host of this stream. I'm the only Ancap here, though I prefer the term voluntarist or free market anarchist because I'm for complete privatization of the market. Though previously, I've done pretty much the usual of most, say, libertarians within the minarchist or Ancap or Agorist circles, because I previously started off as I was indoctrinated into the Keynesianism, or Keynesianism, that's how you pronounce it. I don't know, because I was originally within the Joe Lieberman, Hillary Clinton camp for 10 years, and for a few years I was within the John McCain, Lindsey Graham camp, though not much difference between the two, obviously. And then I discovered Ron and Rand Paul. They brought me into libertarianism, and then a few years later, I discovered Eric July. He helped tie the knot in helping me becoming an anarchist. So yeah, here I am today. So, were you gonna say something, Esso?
No, I just had my mic muted the whole time.
Oh, okay. I thought I heard something. Okay. So with that being said, let's go ahead and so the first half of this episode, I was thinking of mainly doing like talking about Agorism or what it's about, and then like on the second half we could do like a Q&A for Gary. So does that sound good?
Whatever works for you guys.
Okay. Okay. So with that being said, Gary, can you give us the basics of what Agorism is all about?
So my guess is your other two guests are going to be better at this than I am. I am happy to identify as a fellow traveler, but it's probably not the space that I've spent the most time thinking about. I mean, my impression is we're talking about a variety of individualist, market-oriented anarchism that really emphasizes the value of nourishing the counter economy, of nourishing that aspect of the economy that the state tries to sweep under the rug and to suppress. And so to the extent that it's possible to function outside the bounds of state control, presuming, of course, that one is nonetheless still actually behaving appropriately in relation to other people. It's just a matter of ignoring state controls. Then market activity becomes simultaneously a means of sustenance and a means of revolt. That would be my brief impression of how I understand it. But I'd love to hear what your other two guests would say.
I think Esso.
I would say it's not. What were you going to say, Nate?
Oh no, I was just gonna let you. Talk about
okay.
it.
Well, I wouldn't
Go right
characterize it as a separate brand of anarchist thought because what agorism is more of a means of abolishing the state, and simply and I think you summed it up pretty well. Agorism is political action intended to create more influence in counter economies, whether that be networks which seek to undermine political and corporatist institutions, or new innovations which incentivize people simply based on their own profit motives to disassociate with the state or look for themselves to find ways around the state. Good examples of which would be like 3D printing, cryptocurrencies, open source development softwares, and but yeah, it's not necessary. Like you could be an anarcho-communist and you can be an agorist. Like try and work through the sort of contradiction there, but it's entirely possible. It's not necessarily exclusive to any brand of market anarchism. It's just a means to get to undermine the state. And the reason agorism, or at the very least, the way in which agorists propose that this is done, is by depriving the state of revenue. And that's pretty straightforward. If the state is functionally unable to collect revenue, then it becomes impossible for the state to sustain itself.
Okay. Heartless, is there anything you wanted to add?
No, Esso summed it up perfectly about Agorism.
All right. Perfect. So I was wondering if or Esso or Gary or Heartless would like to explain why we should not use the term capitalism.
Well, so I can talk about two reasons that might occur to me. One, I think, is probably the most important, and that's that it's an anti-concept. It really ends up being, I think, confusing. That is, it often seems to be used with a meaning, and I'm completely dependent on my friend Roderick Long here for this point. It ends up being used with a meaning like the free market system we have now. But of course, what we have now isn't a free market system. And so you can either accept that it's a free market system, and then judge that all the awful things we observe in today's society are products of the free market, or you can accept that it's the thing we have now, in which case you might not, want to accept that it has anything to do with the free market once we recognize how much intervention there is, how much corporatism there is, and so forth. So it's an anti-concept, I think, that really ends up just causing confusion. And I guess I would say that by identifying as proponents of capitalism, we run the risk of seeming to place a libertarian free market imprimatur on the status quo. And if instead we see ourselves as radical critics of the status quo, who definitely understand why some of our colleagues and friends and comrades elsewhere on the political spectrum might reject that status quo, then I think it behooves us, if we want to make a plausible case for the attractiveness of markets, to emphasize that the arrangements we observe around us today aren't the products of market activity, but precisely instead the results of interference with market activity.
And that's exactly what I would say is very attractive, and I'd say is very credible about the concept of free markets. Is politically it aligns, like if you were to look within the political dichotomy which everyone is sort of brought up in through civics and government schools, the media, or the political system, it appeals to both of their interests simultaneously.
Yeah.
It doesn't, and that's, if you were to use the term capitalism, well, it turns the left, so to speak, off pretty much right away, and yeah, then you get neocons to easily associate themselves with your ideas, which is something that's probably the biggest reason, biggest problem politically with the Libertarian Party, aside from the fact that you can't have a Libertarian Party. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's what happened, is they tried to associate themselves with like liberal, neoliberal, classical conservative concepts. So what ended up happening is the state started using the term libertarian through the media, where they started having politicians using the term libertarian, and then it's a tactic known as co-optation. So basically, it doesn't mean libertarianism anymore. It doesn't mean a rejection of political authority. It's basically interchangeable with someone who believes in like neoliberalism at this point. But yeah, that has nothing to do with libertarianism. But what I was getting to is another big part of the reason I was sort of touching upon before we started streaming is that, you sort of mentioned this, but the term, like a term like capitalism or socialism, these terms are deliberately designed to encompass philosophies which already exist and to be used as buzzwords in political debate. And they're essentially employed to destroy the ability of the average person to discuss these concepts in detail. For example, in mainstream politics, both a Keynesian and an Austrian could be considered a capitalist, even though those two belief systems are diametrically opposed to one another. Yeah. So the term is basically meaningless, and it only serves as a way to obfuscate, essentially.
Is voluntarist a better term?
Well, yeah, I'd say that it's more accurate, but there's nothing necessarily stopping them from doing the exact same thing to voluntarism. In fact, yeah, a couple of people, I think you were one of them, Heartless, have been linking screenshots of your textbooks describing Herbert Hoover as a voluntarist.
So one thing, just to be pedantic, it is important to distinguish between the term that's been used by radical market types, I think, since the end of the 19th century, which is voluntarist, versus voluntarist, which is just someone who believes in voluntary action or free will or something like that.
Well, they use the term voluntarist. Yeah, I'm aware of the term voluntarist as well, but that's that only further proves my point. Is it's already similar sounding to another concept which the state loves. So I think a good term to associate with would be freed market or agorism, because for one thing, freed markets, it inherently implies that you're seeking a model of society which doesn't already exist. That's another great reason why I think that that's a great term to describe free markets. But yeah, if you associate with agorism and counter economics, there's no way for the state to beneficially co-opt those terms, because fundamentally, regardless of what ideology agorism is associated with, at the end of the day, you're encouraging people to find ways around the state and to deprive the state of revenue. So, I mean, they're scared of the concept to even mention it in the media.
Yeah, I think you're very right that with respect to that concept, opposition to the state is built in. And so it becomes very difficult to twist the meaning in some way that is supportive of state power.
Trying to remember what else. Essa, do you have any other important points that SEK3 have brought up
regarding agorism, or regarding this
agorism in general?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you mean. Like, I recently did a pretty long video explaining the Austrian case against wage labor, which that was an argument that Konkin made, pretty simplified. The natural conclusion of free markets would be sort of localized, self-reliant producers, and I was citing Hayek and Mises for the most part. Like Hayek's conception of efficiency necessarily leading to more decentralized production and cheaper production costs.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I don't know specifically what you mean. I mean, the concept that Konkin argued, I guess another thing I could say about it is a good selling point of agorism as well would be that it's not necessarily political, and I sort of touched upon that already, but it appeals to people financially, and it's at that point, it's not necessarily a most means of opposing the state and protesting the state, and most forms of direct action require some sort of cost on the individual, which means that the only, consistent way that you're going to get people out and organizing and actually working towards this end goal is for them to ideologically align. Now, agorism is a form of direct action, but it doesn't work like that, because agorism is actually financially beneficial. So it actually it's not associated with any sort of cost, even if the person who is engaging in counter-economic practices is not ideologically an agorist.
How does counter-economics benefit? Or trying to
how is it beneficial?
Yeah, there we go. That was the term I was looking for.
Well, what it does is it creates Agorism seeks to create innovations and create by speculating with resources and creating groups and communities around that, and also creating networks of associating online or shops, which yeah, they outcompete the state. A great example of this historically would be Lysander Spooner's American Mail Company. He started in 1844. And like I've seen people trying to say, oh well, if you had private businesses delivering mail, it would never show up. They'd just take your, they just take your money. Well, in 1844, a small company was delivering cross-country mail faster and cheaper than the post office in 2019. So. But yeah, it's beneficial in the sense that it's remarkably easy to outcompete the state, because yeah, the state itself is well, there's no competition. There is it doesn't. I'm getting loaded with a bunch of Skype messages, but sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. But anyway, yeah, it can just take more money whenever it needs more money. So it has virtually, like, the marginal utility for a dollar for the state is significantly less for that of a non-politically connected individual simply pooling their resources together and trying to make profit by trading around the state. But that's the appeal to it, is that it's profitable, and it undermines state organizations and the corporatist entities which they've propped up, which also suffer from similar problems because of the state's intervention in the market.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else want to add on to that?
I just want to say I'm sorry if I'm a bit rambly. Like, that's something people complained about in the last stream, but I have a lot to say. It's hard to sum it up very quickly.
I think you're saying great stuff.
Well, thank you.
There's another. Oh yeah, I just remembered. So there was one thing that Konkin rejected, which is voting. I mean, I'm not much of a voter myself. I don't think any Agorist ever would vote. So what is the basic problems of voting? And this is just for any statist or monarchist out there who is trying to understand what Agorists mean by, we should not vote at all.
Well, Konkin's position against the Libertarian Party, I've sort of gone over a couple of these points already. He recognized that it was basically a group of neocons and neoliberals attempting to co-opt the label in order to, yeah, it was going to become mainstream, but by becoming mainstream, it would basically become just another state philosophy. And yeah, he was warning people about, philosophers like Nozick, and they would refer to themselves as minarchists nowadays, which is a term Konkin himself coined, but he also referred to them as nosies, which I love that one a bit more. But yeah, what it was going to do is it was going to basically obscure what libertarianism was actually principally about, and sure enough, he was right about that. But also, yeah, principally, Konkin was against the Libertarian Party. I mean, he has economic grounds, which I'll also mention, but principally he rejected the Libertarian Party, or partyarchy as he referred to it, mainly because his argument against the party system was that in order to actually engage in the party system, in order to be a politician, you necessarily have to act in the state's interests, which I think has been shown to be demonstrably right time and again. There's that rather infamous Princeton 2014 study showing that the laws that are passed have absolutely no they have absolutely no bearing on their polling popularity with voters. But then if you compare them to political interest groups and what politicians want, what laws they want to pass, then it's nearly identical, the likelihood of passing with the bill's popularity. And, then there's also the fact that, as a politician, you make money by working for the state. And in order to do that, you have to sustain the state. And to sustain the state, you have to ensure that it is able to sustain itself. And by doing that, you have to expand its influence over society. You have to enforce all these laws, so to speak, which will initiate violence against peaceful people. Konkin, he used the term "watch the action," and I think that's a great way to describe it. You can have a libertarian politician, quote unquote, saying that they're gonna lower tax rates, but ultimately they're still going to use the state to initiate force against you. If you were to actually compete with the state and break the law, well, you can have a libertarian judge and libertarian police come arrest you and throw you in jail. But you might get a lighter sentence, but you're still going to be kidnapped and imprisoned. So, but
Right.
and that was more or less his point. Sorry for rambling again, but yeah, a libertarian politician is impossible because principally libertarianism contradicts the interests of the state.
Right.
I have seen some agorists go out and vote to expand the state just so the counter economy can grow. Because I think the Senate
Accelerationism.
yes, accelerationism, that.
Well, I mean, as I mentioned, voting doesn't really matter. What's going to happen is going to happen. You could even prove, you don't even really need the figures proving this. You could just do a basic thought experiment. What's going to happen if absolutely nobody voted? Of course, that's not going to happen, but if it did happen, what would happen? Oh, you would have the Supreme Court choose who's going to be the President of the United States. Okay, so it's not really up to the voters, it's up to the other politicians and their political interests. So, but Konkin's argument also against the party system, aside from the points that I've already made, the points that I've already addressed, is that he argued that because what actually undermines the state is competing with it and speculating with your time and resources into creating these counter-economic associations and products, at best, even assuming that you could achieve some sort of change by voting within the political system and by engaging in the political system, the only thing, what's actually going to cause political change to occur is by destabilizing the state, by making it unable to actually collect revenue. So, at that point, voting or any other political action is essentially just a waste of time and resources.
One thing we should mention about Agorism, Agorism's position on intellectual property. That's something that we should talk about.
Yeah. What is the position on intellectual property?
Well, it's dependent on the agorist. If you're asking Konkin's position, Konkin was an in favor of intellectual property. Neither am I. What's your position, Gary? I haven't heard your argument on intellectual property.
Yeah, I'm an IP skeptic, and I probably developed that idea most extensively in the chapter on property in my book, Anarchy and Legal Order. You know, I'd say there are other things to say about the topic, but it seems to me that intellectual property rules, first of all, interfere with people's use of their own physical property in ways that otherwise, you know, wouldn't be acceptable. They also serve to stifle innovation and stifle the free movement of information. So I'm quite doubtful about IP rules.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, considering that I've been on the brunt end of exactly that situation, trying to develop something, and intellectual property law making it so I've had to go through open source development to get around it. But yeah, you can't declare ownership over an idea, because if somebody is creating something, you know, with their resources, they're not depriving you of anything. They're creating something else.
Precisely.
There's no way that you can legitimately consider that a form of theft, at least in any way which would stand up to scrutiny.
Yeah, if you believe in robust rights to, if you will, ordinary conventional physical property, then immediately those rights run into conflict with intellectual property, which just says, yes, you own this or that or the other thing, but there's some abstract pattern that you can't configure your own property in accordance with. And that seems on its face a pretty striking interference with your use of your own physical stuff.
Mm.
Yeah, the only way that it could work is if your idea of property rights were basically something that the state defines, which I can't stand that one, but yeah, some people believe that, and pretty much every argument I've ever had about intellectual property, the person that I'm arguing against has that conception of property rights or something similar to it.
I mean, some defenders of intellectual property rights will argue in broadly utilitarian terms in ways that, you know, you could imagine being implemented by, a stateless legal system enacted on by individuals. But the problem, I think, with those utilitarian arguments, which basically say we wouldn't get the the productivity or the fruitfulness that an IP regime offers us without strong intellectual property protections. I would say the problem there is, first of all, it seems to ignore the actual historical evidence that a lot of fruitful and creative activity, has happened demonstrably in the absence of IP. Also, I think that approach ignores the clear negatives that come with IP, the way in which IP stifles innovation and free flow of information. And then on top of that, I think there's all the problems with utilitarian arguments generally, with the assumption that somehow it's possible to rank states of affairs and declare which ones are clearly somehow more value productive than others. But anyway, yeah, I mean, so I think there are some approaches to defending IP that don't necessarily depend on a sort of positive law view, but even those, I think, depend on arguments that we would have a reason to push back against.
Yeah, Jeffrey Tucker made a pretty decent observation, which was that out of every major medical innovation since 1930, I think it was, only 2 of them were registered through the patent office. And
nice.
if you actually look at the FDA, how they've structured their sort of patent system, I mean, they pretty much outright state that it's like they've argued it's illegal, while the state has declared it's illegal to sell something without a patent. And any quote-unquote new compound, which is incredibly subjective, can't be patented. So I'd imagine that there are hundreds, maybe thousands of products which the world has been deprived of simply because of the FDA.
Yeah, to hell with you.
Pretty much.
Yeah, definitely.
But another problem with that argument, which you just presented for intellectual property, is it has a very anachronistic view of markets. Like, there are certain industries which only exist because of licensing laws and the extra expense created by them. A great example of which would be the medical insurance industry. Didn't even exist until 1925. After the 1918 licensing laws. Prior to that, I mean, yeah, healthcare was so cheap you could just go into a clinic and pay for it with pocket change. But yeah, if you're going to actually, create more resources, what you're doing is not creating fewer products. Obviously, what's happening is you're experiencing a greater productive output because the ability to produce has become decentralized and more people are able to produce more and also consume more. So you have a greater deal of wealth being created, but you don't have these centralized conglomerates anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that's real productivity as opposed to kind of paper productivity that comes only when, and here, so I draw the immediate example from Kevin Carson, but he's drawing on an English economist whose name is escaping me right now. IP is a classic example. Licensing laws offer another classic example of just putting toll gates in place, right? It's not that, there's some inherent productivity going on. Rather, a particular group is able to siphon resources into its own pockets simply by fencing in something that wouldn't otherwise be fenced in, and demanding a toll, demanding tribute. That's a far cry from real productivity, and I think you rightly emphasize the distinction there.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty great example. But yeah, pretty much. If you were to put a toll booth in the middle of the road, more people would just stop using that road, or you wouldn't have as many people traveling as you would have otherwise. So you'd be cutting down significantly on production and productive capacity.
Yeah, and you're not adding value in any way. You're just redistributing value to yourself.
So yeah, I mean, a lot of people, when arguing for private roads, they bring up, oh, well, what are there just going to be toll booths everywhere? Probably not. People may just build roads around those if that were the case. No, the owners of roads are more than likely going to either profit off of, buildings and businesses advertising on the sides of the roads, or being incentivized to build roads, because those roads connect to their businesses.
Yeah, there are lots of other market models that don't depend on toll booths.
Or it could just simply be a community building a road, through their housing. That happened in Iowa, Route 6 in 1918, I think it was.
I mean, most roads are privately built, I believe.
Yeah, Domino's builds the roads. It's amazing.
Have you seen that, Gary? That Domino's started filling in potholes.
That's so awesome. I can imagine how the potholes would get in the way of Domino's delivery drivers, but I hadn't heard that story until just now.
It's kind of like you could go to Domino's and get a pizza, and the money that you pay can be used to fix the roads.
Nice.
Yeah, that was they announced that last year. I don't know if they're still doing it, but
they're still doing it. I still see articles about it. They're still doing it, so it's great.
There is one other thing that I'd like to ask about before we can probably do the Q&A for Gary, which is the non-aggression principle applicable to Agorism? Silence.
Well, I mean, it just seems as if, you know, I think as Esso in particular has described the position, we're talking about a strategy rather than a distinctive normative position within libertarianism or market anarchism. And so, I mean, you know, take the example that we've talked about a couple of times now of the anarcho-communist who wants to undermine the state despite herself being completely opposed to private property and market exchange. You know, over the long term, you know, there might still be a reason for her to therefore, while rejecting at least what you know, say a Rothbardian would regard as an essential element of non-aggression, namely robust property rights, while rejecting that, you know, it seems like that anarcho-communist could still engage in market transactions outside the sphere of state control and could do so in a way that was, as a matter of fact, respectful of other people's bodies and property, even without regarding the property as inherently legitimate. There might be just pragmatic reasons to do that. So if we understand this as a strategy, then it seems to me non-aggression doesn't necessarily enter in, at least in an obvious way.
Yeah, I have a couple of ANCOMs who are agorists in my Discord server. I don't know if you're familiar with Discord, but it's basically a website where you create like chat servers, and you can have people join them, and it's private. But yeah, their justification is usually either that it's a pragmatic position to take, or that they're communists in the sense that they want to start like a mutual aid organization. So it's not actually aggressing upon others. It's just, people working according to Marxian principles.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's interesting for sure. But did you have anything else, Nate or Gary?
I've got nothing else. Oh, go ahead.
I think one thing is, I guess to explain to people, like, I have people ask me if Agorism can work, then why hasn't it worked before? And you talked about it, Esso, before, I remember.
Well, it's not really something that people say about Agorism, because for one thing, there are plenty of examples which you can point to of people engaging in counter economies to undermine the state. A great example would be people trading in gold and silver under the table during the Great Depression. But they typically say that about anarchism, and that's the problem with that argument, is that it's entirely circular. And it's also completely ahistorical, because you have examples of individualist anarchies operating, such as Kospaya or Neutral Morsenet.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But something I was going to say about the example of using gold and silver to undermine the state is, at that time, you didn't have private, like, encrypted ledgers. That's a big part of what's different now from what would have been the standard in the 1930s, and that is largely a politically motivated agorist innovation, cryptocurrencies and encrypted ledgers. But yeah, so at that time, the only way to get gold or silver, the state has pretty much always had a pretty tight monopoly over that commodity. Any way that you obtain gold or silver, you have to go through some sort of firm which specializes in it, which is registered with the state, and the state checks up on and regulates pretty heavily. So they can easily track your transactions through these firms. And that's exactly how they managed to shut down most of the counter economies in during the Great Depression. FDR created Executive Order 6105, at which had the U.S. Treasury confiscate 70% of American gold assets. But yeah, now you can't do that because you have all these wallets, and you have these entirely self-contained, decentralized networks, which essentially make tracking transactions entirely impossible unless you were to go through, some sort of government agent or centralized firm to obtain your cryptocurrencies. And even then, they wouldn't have any proof of how much you have unless you actually showed them your wallet, which they can't even really prove that you are still using whatever wallet address they have.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. So I was wondering, you want to transition to the Q&A?
Rock and roll.
Yeah. So I guess the first question that I could ask Gary is, I'm going to beat Jeff Berwick from the Anarchist in asking this question. How did you become an anarchist?
Yeah, I suspect I've answered that question for Jeff. I did an interview with him a few years ago.
Oh, okay. I didn't see your interview. Weird.
Probably 2012, maybe.
Okay. Yeah, that was a while ago.
Yeah, it was a while ago. Yeah, I met Jeff in a parking lot in North San Diego County, anyway, long story. So, how did I become an anarchist? So, I would say it's a little complicated. I became a libertarian originally, I think, because I shared a lot of the characteristics of many libertarians of my generation, which is to say that I read science fiction and I programmed computers and I was socially awkward. And so that, just kind of lent itself naturally toward moving in a libertarian direction. My parents were Goldwater Republicans, and I probably took over some things that they said and radicalized those things, really pushed them in a, in a more, as I would say, consistent direction. And I found myself reading Rothbard, reading Hayek, reading Robert Anton Wilson, and really beginning at the end of my adolescent life to kind of flourish as a libertarian. And indeed, I probably at some point would have used the word anarchist for myself. I don't know that I thought really carefully about distinctions between anarchism and minarchism at that point. Probably the high point of my my youthful libertarianism was a stint on the Wally George show. If anybody in this group or the listening audience remembers Wally George, he was one of the early right-wing insult media figures, and so I was physically removed from his show at one point. Pretty funny. Anyway, but I was distracted for a considerable period in college and after by the fairly sort of conventional social democratic political environment that it's easy to fall into, and I probably had not thought through some things as much as I might have, and I just sort of drifted into that more conventional social democratic political space. What really brought me back to libertarianism and to anarchism, two things. First of all, George Bush and Barack Obama certainly radicalized me. It just became so apparent how authoritarian and militarist their respective administrations were. Despite the superficial differences, it was obvious that they were very much up to the same things. And it was very hard to take conventional politics seriously when I saw what these figures on the conventional political stage tended to actually do. And at the same time, I rediscovered libertarianism while really engaging with much more sophisticated and nuanced accounts of libertarian ideas that took on board some of the social and cultural concerns that had prompted me to spend a while as a social democrat, while at the same time allowing me to really come home to libertarianism. So I'm thinking here again about people like Roderick Long and Charles Johnson and Kevin Carson, who really gave me a lot to think about. In particular, I remember what an exciting period it was for me to read the draft chapters of Carson's organization theory on his website as he was in the course of preparing them, and to realize how how eye-opening this was, because I couldn't stand big hierarchical organizations. Certainly, one of my deep-seated visceral commitments was to push back against those kinds of organizations. But here was Carson showing me why those organizations really depended in significant ways on state power, and why getting the state out of the economy would undermine key factors that led to the growth of organizational hierarchies and so forth. And so anyway, Carson and Long and Johnson, Sheldon Richman, a very dear friend, and some others, really helped me to come home to libertarianism by giving me a richer and broader understanding of what individualist anarchism really would look like. And so the short answer is, I started out moving from a kind of conservatism to full-blown libertarianism, letting go of that libertarianism for a while, getting radicalized and being brought back to libertarianism and to anarchism by the insightful stuff that I discovered, courtesy of Robert and Kevin and
Sheldon. Any other questions? Anybody?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's very interesting that you left libertarianism and then you came back to it. Usually that doesn't happen.
Yeah, and it's hard for me to really spell out, more in much more detail than I've already offered exactly how that happened. I mean, there's a sense in which I was perhaps a little surprised to find my way back there, but I think so another thing I guess I should have mentioned is that when I was in graduate school, I discovered the work of the great contemporary English philosopher Stephen R.L. Clark. And there are Stephen's views about many things are very complicated, but there's certainly an important sense in which he's a libertarian anarchist. And in his book, Civil Peace and Sacred Order, I confronted ideas that I guess I'd probably run across elsewhere, but that really made it impossible to see state authority as enjoying any kind of legitimacy. And I don't think I ever kind of turned my back on that idea. And when I was probably just coming to the end of my naive statism a few years later, I remember writing an article that basically made a sort of Spoonerian point about law. It was a piece, and I wasn't thinking about Spooner when I wrote the piece, but it was a piece called Disaggregating Legal Obligation. And the point I was trying to make was there are some kinds of legal obligation that flow from the inherent requirements of justice, and those are worth taking seriously, but they're not worth taking seriously because of the source of law. And on the other hand, there are other elements of a legal code that are just products of arbitrary legislative authority. And if you don't see that as at all legitimate, then there's no real reason to take those enactments seriously. And I remember early on, one of the first signs of my re-immersion in libertarianism and anarchism was running across an article by the Georgetown philosopher Mark Murphy, in which he tried to argue against this cluster of positions he called philosophical anarchism, which I take it often just means anarchists who don't actually want to do anything but think in the abstract that state authority is unsupportable. And he thought that he had a knockdown, drag-out argument against philosophical anarchism. And given what I had already concluded about the illegitimacy of state enactments, it was just, it was great fun actually to try to respond in considerable detail to what he had said there. So, I think so part of why I found myself coming back to libertarianism, to anarchism, was this recognition that, nothing I had seen since I first encountered Stephen Clark's work in the late 80s had given me any reason to treat state authority as legitimate. And I had bracketed that question for a while, but I couldn't do that anymore.
Because, a big thing that I've noticed with a lot of former libertarians, or people who call themselves former libertarians, is that if you look at their work or their arguments from back when they claimed to associate with libertarianism, they really only had a pragmatic argument for free markets, but that's, as I've mentioned before, that's not really just what libertarianism is. Libertarianism is an ethical position. So, and that's mainly they were basically liberals, but they thought of themselves as libertarians. So, if you were as a liberal to challenge political authority, your argument would essentially boil down to, well, I have Cheetos in video games, so I'm right. And their argument, all they would have to do is say, well, I'm a black tranny, so I'm right.
Well, that's political argument at its finest.
But yeah, it's when you have no principled libertarian argument, and that's what's so dangerous about co-optation is, once you actually, get libertarianism away from its principled argument and towards something which is safe for the state, it's not too easy. It's not too difficult to drag people away from libertarian ideas because, well, they never really had a principled argument to begin with. Aside from, the obvious characteristics of ideas which are promoted by the state, very collectivist, trying to promote the idea of group interests, and they always seem to just conveniently come back to the idea of being convenient, of your interests being perpetuated by the state. That's one really cancerous thing about ideas promoted in mainstream politics, is none of them have any ethical principles. So if a Marxist were to come along, or if some sort of existentialist like a Nietzsche sort of fascist were to come along and propose principled arguments, well, it's nothing like they've ever heard before. So it's pretty easy to convince them of those positions when they don't have anything that they've ever heard before to compare it to.
Yeah, I think resting content with superficial justifications for most things that are important probably isn't very helpful.
But the other side of that is that philosophical libertarianism on those same grounds is incredibly powerful because it has these principled explanations for human action, and that can attract a lot of people.
Yeah, it can attract people who value clarity and depth of understanding, which, of course, as we know, isn't everyone.
Well, a great thing that I've been noticing recently, and I don't know if you have as well, but ever since 2016, and you can prove this by looking at Google search trends and political trends, there's been a major uptick in communism, anarchism, and alt-right groups. Now, what that tells me is exactly what you just mentioned. People are becoming disillusioned and disenfranchised in mass and are looking for things which provide a deeper understanding.
I think that's right. Yeah. And I think the existing political order is being increasingly revealed as not only irrelevant, but actually hostile to the interests of many people, and the inherently exploitative character of the state, and the completely untrustworthy character of, the typical state functionary, is becoming harder and harder for people to avoid.
Right. Oh, I lost my train of thought. If anybody, I'm sorry, I had a question. And then I just lost it. Well, it's coming back to me.
Can I ask one while you're thinking?
I'm sorry?
Could I ask one while you're thinking, or has it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you mentioned that you got more into libertarianism again because of the militarism and the just general state expansion of Bush and Obama. What do you think about what's currently going on with the state under the Trump administration?
Yeah, so what I think is interesting about that is the combination of superficial differences and deep similarities, right? So there are particular policy moves that Trump's immediate predecessors probably wouldn't have made. Despite I think probably bad ideas with respect to trade and immigration, Obama and Bush would both have been much better probably on those issues than Trump has been. On the other hand, the deep idea that unites all of them and their predecessors is the idea that nationalism somehow makes sense, that there is this cohesive social unit that's the nation, that somehow state power should be used to preserve, to extend, and so forth. And so Trump uses nationalist rhetoric much more than either Bush or Obama, and I think that rhetoric is therefore revealed for the turd soup that it is. But at the same time, the underlying philosophy that allows state actors to justify seeking to mobilize other people's bodies and resources and loyalty in support of particular projects really is no different at a deep level. And so when Bush, starts wars in the Middle East and requires us to pay for them and so forth, when Obama continues all of that, when both Bush and Obama, bail out, a variety of favored corporations, so forth. Fundamentally, the underlying view that our resources are theirs to take, our bodies are theirs to manage, it's really no different from the attitude underlying Trump's nationalism. It's just that Trump expresses the position in a more blunt and obnoxious way. So I think there are policy differences that we could talk about at some length, and yet ultimately, it seems to me, Trump and Bush and Obama share a great deal, and among other things, certainly share in general a willingness to be militarists and imperialists. And so we recognize, of course, that there are some people who thought that they supported Trump because they took him to be in some way an anti-militarist, an anti-imperialist. I think that's just utterly false. The reality is that Trump has made what are, on my view, marginally sensible choices to not try to escalate hostilities in some ways with North Korea or with Russia. The fact is, he still wants to confront Russia militarily and, through black ops and so forth in other ways. But meanwhile, the attacks, for instance, on Iran, the attempt to start a war with Iran that Trump's buddy John Bolton favors, and the imposition of sanctions in a way that really amounts to a kind of warfare already, just show that Trump's a militarist too. He's just perhaps a militarist with a slightly different flavor of militarism. So we can always talk about the differences among politicians, and there are particular things that some politicians do that are especially awful, and we can dwell on those. But the thing I would just emphasize is the degree to which it's obvious that there's real continuity.
Well, the main thing that that's actually sort of the main thing I was going to ask about is I've actually noticed something under Trump's administration, which is that the amount of drone strikes which have been occurring in military activity around the world on the part of the U.S. government, and the amount of new federal regulations, the amount of it seems to be gradually increasing per administration, regardless of the ideologies being proposed. Which, on top of sort of going back to what I was saying earlier about Konkin's argument, which he observed, that's sort of where that was first pointed out to me, is from Konkin, but I began to look up figures and see for myself that he was spot on. But what it shows is that the state sort of ascends ideology, in that politicians aren't really working in their own in like the interests of an ideology. They're working simply in a singular interest, which is to perpetuate the state's influence over society, to sustain the state. But
yeah, I mean, what I like to say to people is, there's one thing we know to a virtual certainty about people who have power, and that is that they're people who want power. They're not randomly selected members of the population. There's a self-selection process. There's filtering here. The sorts of people who come to exercise power almost certainly do so because they've developed and exhibited a capacity to acquire and maintain power. And if that's their gift, as it were, then it's probably not surprising that they exercise it, and they exercise it in particular to retain their positions. And if they're people who really want power, it's not very surprising that they act in ways that preserve and extend that power, and that of course, then serve to not just increase their individual influence, but also increase the influence of the institutions in which they participate, so that others with superficially different ideological positions will also end up using those institutions in one way or another to exercise, but also to extend their power. So, yeah, I think I'm completely with what you just said.
But another thing, I suppose this is sort of a question, but I wanted to ask if you'd noticed this as well, which is, are you familiar with programs like Operation Mockingbird, or organization or international cartels such as the Council on Foreign Relations, which are funded by most of the major governments in the world, and they control or have significant influence in every major media company?
So I'm certainly aware of the CFR, and while I've run across the label Operation Mockingbird, I had to quickly refresh my memory when you were talking, so that I could actually say something intelligent about it. And I think the notion that those in power seek to shape the media conversation in ways that help to perpetuate their influence should hardly surprise us.
Yeah, well, the state's been doing that for at least the last 50 years, but how this relates to to the Trump administration specifically is it's gotten really bad in the last 4 years, where I've noticed that but basically the narrative on every single one of these media outlets is it's always attempting to manipulate people towards thinking that certain ideas are opposition to the political establishment, and that the establishment is some group of politicians working individually in their own interests, as if a politician is supposed to represent the people. Have you seen that deep state narrative?
I mean, certainly the notion that politicians are supposed to represent the people, but by George, this particular group of politicians isn't doing so. So what we need to do is to get rid of them and get some politicians who really do represent the people, get back to where we belong. I think is one of the most pernicious narratives in the political space, right? Because what it does is allow every group that's really immersed in the state to sort of promote itself as a group of outsiders representing the interests of the people, while nonetheless co-opting people's opposition to others who exercise power. And the notion that it's just a sort of random fact about these particular politicians that they behave the way they do is to miss actually something else that Sam Konkin really highlighted, that some people in my ideological neck of the woods have wanted to recover, is the notion that libertarians really ought to be talking much more about the idea of class. Right? Because it's not just about this or that politician as an individual miscreant. It's about the notion of class as a salient political variable. And so, of course, the focus here then is not on class as, say, a kind of stereotypical Marxist might understand it, as is so that first and foremost, class membership is understood in virtue of somebody's relationship to the means of production. Instead, of course, libertarian, and before it, radical classical liberal class theory has said, no, what defines class membership is the relationship somebody has to state power. And but that the relationships to state power can, in fact, yield commonalities of interest and commonalities of culture. Murray Rothbard, in a couple of his well-known essays, Anatomy of the State and Wall Street Banks and American Foreign Policy, probably some others, but those are the two that come to mind immediately. Rothbard wants to talk about the ways in which very concrete relations among particular people, family ties and so forth, just the sorts of things that might show up in a conventional Marxist narrative, really serve, in fact, to illuminate the libertarian narrative about state power, because they highlight the ways in which people who have access to state power hang on to that access and utilize it to in one way or another, maintain their own positions and benefit their cronies and so forth. And so, I think, it's just such a mistake to pretend that, we just have this, by George, this particular group of miscreants in office, and that we can throw the rascals out and put in the virtuous, all will be well. It seems to me that just completely misunderstands both what it takes to become somebody who exercises state power and the kinds of temptations that state power offers, even to people who might start out, more virtuously.
I do.
Very interesting, is all I was going to say.
Okay. So, I was gonna ask if you were a non-interventionist, though you pretty much answered that question earlier.
In foreign policy.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, my own view is that there's nothing that builds state power like like war. Okay,
Yeah.
and I think that even if your only concern is very narrowly with domestic liberty, the preservation of liberty domestically, you have every reason to oppose the warfare state because it serves so obviously to expand and consolidate state power. But also, I think if you care about property rights and body rights in principled ways, then what you're going to acknowledge is that war is a dramatic interference with those. I mean, it just involves so much, horrible, violence against ordinary people's bodies and lives that I think nobody who really values, human liberty, human well-being can be neutral about war. I mean, I think there's a bunch of other things we might say about that. There's an essay I wrote some years ago that I always seem to get the title wrong, even though it's my own essay. I think the title is "Violence, Wars, and States," in which I try to talk a bit more about this. But I think there's a bunch of overlapping stuff that really counts against any sort of endorsement of aggressive warfare. I'm not a pacifist. I think that there certainly can be times when individuals can quite reasonably, either as individuals or in cooperation with others, use force to repel violence. But I think state-made wars should be opposed pretty much across the board.
Well said.
I do have one more.
Oh, okay.
I do have one question. How would you define right wing or and left wing? Because a lot of people have their own definitions.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I've puzzled over that as it happens. And I don't think that there is, with respect to the definition of any contentious term, I don't think that it's possible with any credibility to slam your fist on the table and say you're wrong because you embrace some other definition. I tend to want to use left as a label for political positions that have something in common, I guess I would say, with the new left of the 1960s, which was, of course, the left that early kind of movement libertarians in that period, sometimes allied with. I would say, broadly speaking, I associate that kind of leftist position with opposition to subordination, exclusion, and deprivation, along with war. Because I think that captures a lot of what the new left at its best wanted to say. And I think there are ways of kind of understanding those things and defending them in libertarian terms, as I try to do in an essay from a few years ago called The Distinctiveness of Left Libertarianism. That term, by the way, itself, since it hasn't shown up here, I mean, Konkin used the term left libertarian, to talk about the family of positions that he identified with. If you read the Wikipedia article about left libertarianism, you'll find that there are 3 or maybe 3.5 different positions that are all described as left libertarian and don't necessarily have a whole lot in common, right? That the term can be used to refer to left-wing market anarchists. It can be used to refer to anarcho-communists, and it can be used to refer, and this is probably actually the most common use in academic discourse today, to kind of contemporary Georgists. And it's all sort of confusing because of that. Anyway, broadly speaking, that's how I'd want to use left, opposition to subordination, exclusion, deprivation, and war. Right is more complicated, obviously, because there are so many. I think, maybe it seems to me, maybe it's an illusion that it seems to me that so many leftist views, at least of any sort of credible sort, have some things in common here. I mean, I tend to think about views on the right as marked by their affirmation of hierarchy and authority. And and that can be traditional European style right-wing views, so-called throne and altar views. It probably also captures something about certain kinds of fascist views where the authority is the authority of the state or, quote, the public. But I think it also captures certain, more New World views that might be seen as right wing, which again are nationalist very often, but also affirm traditional authorities in the realm of the family. I think often tend to be suspicious of gender equality and so forth. And, while some of us might think, okay, there are these good Carsonian arguments for lack of hierarchy in the workplace on economic grounds, and there are other kind of moral arguments against workplace hierarchies of certain kinds, which I've tried to offer. You might still think, well, in particular contexts, maybe those hierarchies are necessary evils. But I think a certain kind of right-wing position relishes those workplace hierarchies along with the political hierarchies. There's a guy who shows up on my Facebook page all the time, who I think is a sort of straight-faced troll. He doesn't realize he's trolling, but I think he in fact is. Who just constantly has to remind by objecting to hierarchy, we're objecting to the order of nature, and I think that again seems to be a defining mark of a certain kind of right position. More to be said there, but that's my first pass.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about specifically you're considering yourself to be a left libertarian and your thoughts on the left-right dichotomy. I personally, I'm different in that regard because I would personally reject the left-right dichotomy entirely on the ground that the left-right dichotomy, in order to characterize an ideology as left or right, it implies that it's going to sort of have a collectivistic policy position, which is not a neutrally undisputed fact of every political ideology, and it implies that groups which advocate for sort of collectivist rule are different on arbitrary grounds. For example, the difference between nationalist social justice versus Marxist social justice. I'm not saying that they're ideologically in conception the same thing, but fundamentally they're a brand of social justice which advocates that individuals have to be subjugated for the benefit of some group. And also, as you were sort of touching upon, it sort of implies that positions can exist within true dichotomies. Like you can have a Georgist, which is like where would that be on the left-right dichotomy? Oh, they'd be. They'd be. You said they'd be left. Some people would consider them to be like in the same position as a minarchist.
Right. When I say they'd be left, I'm not offering an opinion about how to classify them. I'm just noting that in contemporary political philosophy, when somebody says so-and-so is a left libertarian, the most common meaning that will occur to the hearer is that person is a kind of Georgist. Think about the work of people like Hillel Steiner and Mike Otsuka and Peter Valentine. It's just, a kind of contingent matter because the Marxist political theorist G.A. Cohen, I think, just assigned that label to these contemporary neo-Georgists, and so it's just as a contingent matter of historical fact. That's why the label seems to be associated with them, and it's just confusing, of course, for those of us who want to call ourselves left libertarians, as again I think Konkin did, who aren't Georgists. So anyway,
I do have a question, and then I've got a question in the live chat. So I when I first read about you, it was on Wikipedia, and then it was saying that you were a socialist. So I was wondering, have you ever considered yourself to be a socialist?
Sure. So let's talk about that. So I mean, in a fairly conventional sense, probably, in when I was somebody who embraced social democratic politics of the kind I mentioned before, sure. But in a libertarian context, what I'd refer listeners to is the great Benjamin Tucker's essay, "State Socialism and Anarchism." If you're not familiar with that, if you're not familiar with Tucker, Tucker was the kind of the guiding light of late 19th and early 20th century individualist anarchism in the U.S. His publication, Liberty, served as a venue for discussions among a range of American individualist anarchists, and he was, of course, particularly interested in affirming the work of Lysander Spooner. And in this essay, which we reprint in the collection that Charles Johnson and I edited, Markets Not Capitalism, and which shows up in a variety of other places. It appears in Tucker's own collection instead of a book. Tucker suggests that ultimately, so he wants to affirm the identity of individualist anarchism, market anarchism of his sort, with socialism. But it's very clear that by socialism, he doesn't mean state ownership of the means of production or collective ownership of the means of production in a non-state environment. What he means is something like addressing the social problem, as it would have been understood then. And the social problem, I suppose, would have especially had to do with what we're seeing as problematic relations between capital and labor, but probably also a range of other social questions in which Tucker and his individualist anarchist allies involved themselves. And so when I've said I'm happy to identify as a socialist, I always say in the Tucker sense. Tucker believes in that essay that markets can achieve the things that that socialists say they want, and so it's an explicitly pro-market position, while also one that refuses to endorse the status quo. So it's an instance of social critique, but it's a thoroughly and unequivocally pro-market kind of social critique. So when I've talked about socialism, it's been with reference to the understanding of the socialist tradition that that Tucker embraced, and that would have been identified with some other early market anarchists.
So it's nothing like supporting Bernie Sanders' brand of socialism, quote unquote.
Bernie Sanders' brand of socialism again involves. I mean, Sanders is a social democrat. He's not a kind of a communist, but Sanders clearly is a guy who wants more state regulations and so forth. I'm not a Sanders supporter, and that's very clearly not what Tucker had in mind. I repeat again, what I want to affirm is the use of socialism by people like Tucker.
Yeah, Tucker, he had an essay where he pretty explicitly makes this point called "What is Socialism?" that he wrote from 1884. And I personally wouldn't associate with the label socialism, for one, because after Marx came along, it basically became interchangeable with his sort of material dialectic, like basically the stage between capitalism and communism in his worldview.
Yeah.
But
sorry, just to say, I think you're absolutely right about the potential for confusion. And one thing that has really prompted me to, not use that language frequently, at any rate, is the reaction of people I take seriously with roots behind the Iron Curtain, for whom it just seems bizarre that anybody might imagine that the word socialism could have a positive meaning. And I defended the use that I employ in the last chapter of Anarchy and Legal Order, and you can read that and take away from it what you will. But I have no desire to be dogmatic about that at all. In significant part because of the freight that I do think for many people, quite understandably, the word carries. I love Tucker and want to keep his legacy alive, but I also want to actually be understood by the people I'm talking to.
Right. It makes a lot more sense now.
That's really all I was going to say is if you call yourself a free market socialist, you're going to end up doing the opposite of calling yourself a free market anarchist, which is you're going to turn everybody away who's in the state constructed political dichotomy, because people on the left are gonna hear that and think, what are you, a mutualist? That's not left enough. That's capitalist. Or the Republicans are gonna hear that and they're gonna stick on socialism, and you're never going to get past that point.
Yeah. The other question is coming from the live chat from Josephat Pineda, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. What he wanted to ask, what are your thoughts on the idea of objectivism?
Wow. Okay, then. So, I can start by trying to tell a story, so that gives me more time to actually think of a good answer. When I was developing as a libertarian, I mentioned that I read Rothbard and Hayek and Wilson, and I certainly also read some Rand. I don't think, even then, even when I really thought of myself as an impassioned libertarian, I don't think Rand spoke to me. I know people for whom Atlas Shrugged was a life-changing experience. And I really respect some people like my friend Roderick and my friend Nira Badwar, for whom there's an immense amount of value in Rand. And I don't want to be dismissive of them, and I don't want to be dismissive of Rand. But I can say that just as a matter of personal taste, I never found Rand appealing. I mean, it's not that I'd never read and enjoyed any individual thing that she said. I certainly did. But for instance, Atlas just never appealed to me as a novel. I never thought it was a very plausible novel. It felt to me like the characters were in large part two-dimensional, and it just didn't work for me. I think that one of the real dangers of that confront all ideological movements is the tendency to embrace a commitment to ideological and therefore to social purity. And you see that among everybody from Southern Baptists to communists. And I think you see it among objectivists. Now, I know that the late Nathaniel Brandon graciously accepted a significant amount of the blame for the cult-like quality of 1960s objectivism, particularly the circle intimately around Rand. But I think whether Brandon, rather than Rand, was responsible for that in that period, one thing we notice, I think, is that later objectivist, kind of orthodox objectivist circles have very frequently been defined by a commitment, again, I think, to ideological and therefore to social purity, to treating libertarians, for instance, as outsiders, but especially treating, unorthodox objectivists as outsiders. And, so I think obviously there's been an enormous amount to learn from various unorthodox objectivists. I think the awesome Chris Skibara in New York, who's written about the intellectual background to Rand's work and has used analytical approaches he's derived from Rand to think about what he calls dialectical libertarianism. Chris is an amazing guy. I love Chris. And I think that somebody like David Kelly has been quite helpful, at least in highlighting the degree to which objectivism should be thought of as an open rather than a closed system. But I think that orthodox objectivism, by really understanding itself in very much the same way as a set of religious dogmas, even if those dogmas are understood to be grounded in reason, nonetheless ends up perpetuating, ironically, many of those features of religious communities which objectivists as atheists might be expected to ridicule and reject. So I'm, my main concerns about objectivism, I think, really have to do with this exclusivistic and purity-oriented conception of ideas and of people. I think, again, that people like Roderick and Nira have found a great deal that's rich and valuable in Rand's thought. I commend to anybody who's not aware of it Roderick Long's great essay, Reason and Value, Aristotle versus Rand, in which Roderick takes, I think, an affectionate but critical view of Rand, and you can get a sense of what he might want to draw from her work. And Roderick and Nira co-wrote the essay about Rand in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is available for free online. You can get more of a sense of their approach there. I don't want to be dismissive of them at all, but for me, while I've read biographies of Rand, I've read Rand's fiction and nonfiction, she's never really done it for me.
Well, I've noticed exactly sort of what you're talking about, and yeah, I wouldn't argue that it's a purity spiral or its exclusivity. Any philosophy which has a sort of a principled approach is going to have a purity spiral naturally, but that's not necessarily going to create internal conflicts or a dogmatic approach, or just a sort of dissociative reality like objectivism, Marxism, or Southern Baptists. The problem mainly with what I've noticed in their conception of how their ideas are going to be put into application is that their conclusion is inseparable from their premise. For example, the conclusion of Marxism is, in their claim, a stateless, classless society without money, communism. But there's no distinction between that and the premise and the arguments for Marxism. So, if you were to actually apply Marxism to some real-world example, what they'll do is they'll fall back and say, oh, well, that's not a stateless, classless, moneyless society, so it's not communism, it's not Marxism. That's state capitalism.
Were you going to say something else?
What I was going to say is objectivists sort of do the exact same thing, except they're even worse, because objective, according to an objectivist, is at this point basically just whatever Ayn Rand said was objective. So,
with that being said, totally agree with you on that, Esso. With that being said, I was able to finally get Atomic the Individualist on. He was going to join us earlier, though unfortunately he got some stuff on his plate. So, Atomic, glad you can finally make it.
I'm glad too. What's up?
So, do you have any questions for Gary?
No, not at the. that was fun. No, I don't. I don't at the moment.
Okay. So, let's see if there are any more questions in the live chat. No, there isn't, except looks like we got a troll on here. I don't know what it is.
I will say one thing, Gary.
Oh,
I do like your views on agorism, and I do like your views on individualism as a whole. I think you're well-rounded, and yeah, you're pretty respectable.
I really appreciate your saying that. Thank you very much.
And I can't hear you, which is fun.
I can hear you, but
yeah. I don't know if you can hear me, Atomic, but he said that he appreciates it.
Yeah, I can hear you, but I can't hear him.
Okay.
Weird.
What I was actually trying to ask this question earlier, but it was I was sort of running on again, so sorry about that. But to be fair, it's not a simple question. What I was getting to is under the Trump administration, you've seen more and more that in the media, they've been creating a lot of these controlled opposition narratives, which the main thing they all have in common is they may be proposing, oh, well, we're different in conception. All the narratives lead towards the exact same conclusion, which is that the state expanding its influence is good. You know, the border wall situation, the trade war, so to speak, the social media censorship that's going on, which, I mean, that itself is a whole Machiavellian can of worms itself, because you've got the FDIC manipulating all these banks and payment processors and getting these basically forcing these companies to disassociate or get hit with finance laws. But anyway, what I was getting to is, what are your thoughts on Baudrillardian hyperreality?
I'm not sure that I can speak with any intelligence about anything Baudrillard had to say, I'm afraid.
Can you repeat that? I need to quickly research that because I've never heard of that before.
Baudrillard's philosophy was basically that media was more or less what I was just presenting, that media narratives are all going to shape around a sort of hegemonic interest, except Baudrillard's conception of it was that it was in the interest of corporations, because he was I don't know if that was because he was a post-Marxist, but he was. But yeah, he was spot on about that, and I think, you know, as I mentioned previously, we know definitively that it's the government creating all these narratives. But yeah, Baudrillard's conception of hyperreality and media analysis is that information itself can't be taken at face value, because the media presents sort of overarching master narratives, which all work towards singular interests, and therefore the narratives and the information should be deconstructed, and the only thing that really matters is what their conclusion is and what their conclusion leads towards. And I've found that if you look at the media that way, you can predict the things that they're going to say and the things that are going to be presented with a remarkable accuracy. And I just wanted to know what you thought about that, because yeah, I seem to be, that's another thing I seem to be alone on within libertarian circles, is my use of postmodern philosophy to analyze the media.
Yeah, I'm definitely not inhospitable to certain strands of postmodernism. I think, for instance, that Foucault has a great deal to offer libertarians and anarchists, and I also think that you know, radical media criticism is important and appropriate for libertarians who want to understand how the ideas and cultural patterns that reinforce and sustain state power are themselves perpetuated, right? So I think I'm not hostile to that at all. And I think it's really striking how much media activity in the US political context, which is the one I know the best, is marked by this really bizarre tendency to simultaneously emphasize radical polarization, so that we constantly hear from tut-tutting political commentators that, we're really in this awful state where things have never been more polarized. And by that, they mean that, the sort of, post-World War II, post-New Deal political consensus has broken down. But the irony is that while there certainly are striking cultural differences between major political factions in the US, at the same time, those aspects of their agendas that bear on war and empire and corporate power turn out to be strikingly similar. It simply isn't the case that, you have meaningful anti-imperialist voices or anti-corporate bailout voices or anti-IP voices anywhere, on the U.S. Political spectrum. And so the irony is that the media repeatedly reinforce the idea that things are radically polarized. And again, I think there are striking cultural differences that different political groups exhibit. But at the same time, the media will simply, I think, entirely underplay the significance of the fact that when it comes to these features of political commitment that have to do with, the power of the warfare state, the military-industrial complex, the intelligence agencies, and the state's corporate cronies, what we find is there's surprising similarity. That's why I always like to say that, Barack Obama served George Bush's third and fourth terms. The media, I think, should be seen as complicit in really obscuring that reality.
I actually have another question from the live chat. It was from the person that I thought was a troll, though it was not a troll. It was they were just telling a joke, luckily. So it's from Individualist Hoplite, and he wanted to know, he or she wanted to know your stance on abortion.
Wait, before that goes, I would just like to say one thing. Lip reading is a skill I really wish I had right now.
So you're just not hearing
myself. I hate my life so much.
Yeah, he's I don't think he hears anything that you've been saying. That's unfortunate.
I mean, he should be able to hear after.
Oh, I'm talking about my brother screaming really loud.
Oh.
Me being unable to move my computer anywhere else, seeing as it's a desktop and it doesn't have internet connection other than Ethernet. So yeah, it's great.
Hey Gary, what do you have to say about all the teenagers who are starting to get into individualist anarchism? Because I know there's only one in here, but there's quite a few of them.
I'm really delighted to hear that. If that's I don't think I was aware of that trend. I'll just say I'm absolutely for it. I think we see a lot of. So I think that people, and this is often true of teenagers more generally, people who don't experience themselves as part of the mainstream are going to find it easy to be attracted to radical political and cultural movements. And when the radical movement to which teenagers are attracted is one that's committed to peaceful, voluntary cooperation and inclusion, rather than exclusion and bomb throwing and so forth. I'm ecstatic about that, and the discovery of market anarchism there. That's great news. I'm just reminded that there are many cultural trends that I'm unaware of, and that was one until you just told me about it.
Well, yeah, as I was mentioning earlier, since 2016, I mean, it's mostly anarcho-capitalism, but just like agorism and various brands of individualist anarchism in general have been massively gaining in influence on social media.
Fun fact, I think I started being a libertarian in 2016. No, maybe not. That's probably when I started my channel. It was like 2017.
Most people I've asked about it have said 2016, 2017. But anyway, what were you going to say, Gary?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I'm trying to think of the best way into this. So what really pleases me is this embrace of, of a genuine commitment to markets, with therefore a kind of necessary devotion to peaceful voluntary cooperation. Because clearly what we're seeing culturally is a lot of the emergence of a lot of radical movements. And radical is a big, broad umbrella term that covers lots of different possibilities. And I'm very happy to embrace the term radical. But I'm really nervous about the way in which not only people in general, but unfortunately, especially people linked with, very often with the libertarian movement, have, sometimes found it really easy, disturbingly, surprisingly, troublingly, confusingly easy to drift over, into, kind of neo-fascist circles of various kinds. And I think starting young and starting radical in the right way may be a kind of inoculation against that, I hope.
Yeah, I've noticed that trend too. It sort of died down, but a big part of that was two things. Firstly, that sort of phenomena I was telling you about, where back in the 80s, libertarianism basically just became another word for liberalism. But also the arguments proposed by Hans Hermann Hoppe. Every single, I'd say, I cannot name a person in the libertarian individualist anarchist circles online who didn't pick up Hans Hermann Hoppe before becoming a neo-fascist or some sort of, Nazi.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess we could talk for a long time about what Hans's own agenda and motives are, and I'm not sure that I'm expert enough to do that. But I think, as a matter of historical fact, it certainly seems like there's a statistically significant correlation there, which troubles me. I'm not sure I know what to do with it, but I suppose.
Well, if you read some of his writings, it's pretty easy to see what's causing that. First of all, the idea of a libertarian social order that Hans Hermann Hoppe had, as if social problems were never mind. But yeah, like Hans Hermann Hoppe has this sort of idea where social problems are just aren't themselves a sort of dysgenic effect caused by the state's influence over society, that social problems are sort of organic and they can be influenced by actors within the culture. And because of that, a lot of people are who are Hoppian, what distinguishes them is they have this sort of cultural idea of libertarianism, where the only way you could have a libertarian society is if you had a bunch of libertarian people in it. And that's going to create some problems, certainly, especially when you when you take into consideration some of the ideas Hans had for what is a libertarian, you know. But okay, no, you go ahead.
Okay, thanks. It was the
painful.
Oh, you had a lot of issues going on back there.
What was painful, Atomic? Your audio problems or my rambling? Can he can't. I don't think he can hear us.
No,
Yeah, I don't think he can hear us.
that's really strange technical difficulty. Okay, so
Oh yeah, my
okay, so it was. I wanted to yeah. So individuals Hoplite in the live chat wanted to know your position on abortion.
Yeah, so I guess my position on abortion is that, as I understand the science of human development, Blackman pretty much got it right in Roe. I think certainly in that it's a very very fine book that helped to shape my thinking about this. The Facts of Life by James Trefil and Harold Morowitz. The cases I think made pretty plausibly that the developing human organism really sort of acquires those features that might make you think that it was entitled to some kind of moral standing, along something like the continuum that Blackman lays out in his Roe opinion. So I guess I'm pretty much in favor then of a kind of gradualist stance there with respect to developing personhood and moral standing that certainly would allow first trimester abortions, and I think probably many second trimester, and of course the third trimester business is more complicated, but you can imagine cases of life and death where where that's permissible too. See, I don't think I differ in any substantive way with.
Okay. On Wikipedia, it says that you are a Seventh-day Adventist. Is that true?
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think you and I are the only two Christian anarchists here on this stream. Can you briefly, or at least briefly, explain how Christianity and anarchism can work together? If I'm wording my question correctly, that is.
Yeah, sure. No, I think it's a really interesting question, right? Because Christianity has often been seen as supporting state power, right? For I suppose for more than one reason, but the key rationale certainly has been something like belief in the divine right of kings, right? The idea which you might get, for instance, in chapter 13 of St. Paul's letter to the Romans, that we should see God as somehow appointing rulers, and therefore any ruler who's appointed who's in place, I guess, deserves to keep that ruler's position, and therefore opposing that ruler's authority is ignoring the fact that God appointed that person. And of course, kings over time have made hay out of that repeatedly. So obviously, to really think through the relationship between Christianity and anarchism would require, a lot of conversation about the variety, in particular, of Christianity you want to defend. But one thing I would say is that the most fundamental aspect, probably, of Christian spirituality and theology is opposition to idolatry. And idolatry is the idea, of course, not exclusively or primarily that it's a mistake to identify God with a statue somewhere. Rather, idolatry, I think, is fundamentally the idea that any bit of finite reality, any creature or set of creatures, or all the creatures there are, could be seen as having infinite, absolute, ultimate value. Right. So the concern about idolatry is that however you understand the relationship between God and the world, God is in some important sense other than the world. And more than the world, and the world simply the world is finite, even if it's really, really big. And so this recognition that idolatry is bad news, that it's really the fundamental spiritual mistake to treat any bit of finite reality as absolute, I think is one of the things I'd want to invoke most confidently in rejecting the idea of state authority, because indeed it seems very much as if what states do is to try to position themselves as, in important ways, beyond criticism, and as deserving a kind of loyalty that simply is never appropriate, I think, for a finite object. And so that's probably the place I would start in talking about what's wrong with state authority from a from a Christian perspective. Another thing that might be important, if you think about that strand of Christianity that's manifest, for instance, in early Quakerism, right? The Quakers emphasized the importance of recognizing the inner light, the presence of God in all of us. Well, that's not just a Quaker peculiarity. If you go to the first chapter of St. John's Gospel, you find this very powerful idea that's not, of course, original with the fourth Gospel. It's there in different ways in both ancient Judaism and in ancient Hellenic Greece, but this idea of the logos, the idea of the underlying order, pattern, meaning, structure of the world, and the idea that it's the logos, thus understood, that becomes flesh in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And the logos is said in John 1 to be, and I think this is one of the most powerful ideas in certainly in Christianity, the most powerful ideas in the Bible, the light that enlightens everyone. And so the idea is the logos is present in and with and under and through everybody, and is a source of reason and the source of wisdom that all people experience. And so again, I think if you have that kind of view, it becomes quite difficult to justify giving some subset of people the authority to run other people's lives, and that's certainly something we found in Quakerism. There's a lot more to be said there, but maybe I've said enough at this point.
Yeah, wasn't the original Quaker colony in Pennsylvania stateless as well?
I don't know that history well enough to say. I mean, my sense is that William Penn thought he was establishing a royal colony that did have some kind of authority structure, but I may be wrong about that. I don't know too well.
Interesting. I mean, to my understanding, there was no effective monopoly and arbitration in Pennsylvania at the time. So,
right.
Yeah, he could have thought of it as a royal structure, but functionally, I mean, it would have been a stateless society if that were the case.
Awesome. Works for me.
We're just a few minutes over the 2 hour mark.
My battery will die in a second.
I'm sorry?
And my battery is going to die in a second.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in that case, so we we can end it here. I usually do at the end. I do a weekly song in my show. So with that being said, it's time for the weekly song. So drum roll, please. This week's weekly song for this very special occasion is a libertarian song called Stateless by Backwards. It's fronted by Eric July, who is an anarchist. Have you heard of Eric July?
I have, yeah.
Yeah. So I will link the song in the description box so that way you all could go and watch it. Any thank yous you want to say to Gary before we go? Anyone?
It was awesome listening to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say it was so awesome to speak with you, Gary, because like I mentioned, you pretty much single-handedly got me into the C4SS crowd of anarchism. And even though I'm not, I don't really agree with everything that's posted on C4SS, I think, I think that it's sort of like, especially the more free market anarchists on C4SS, it's sort of like a more complete version of Mises and the conventional Austrian thinkers. Because that's sort of the problem that I noticed even when I would have considered myself to be an Ancap, is they sort of have this anachronistic view of markets, how everything's always going to be centralized simply because that's more efficient. But if you look at their own theory, that's just simply not true.
Right.
Yeah.
Just to make sure the battery doesn't die. For those of you who had questions for Gary, I wish we had more time, though. Maybe Gary, you might come on some other time in the future. We'll see.
That would be an honor.
One last thing I was going to say is you described yourself getting into libertarianism as a science fiction fan and programmer. There's not a single, like, that is also very common in the circles that exist among the YouTubers. Like I mentioned myself, I'm involved in a couple development projects, but I mean, so is Filthy Heretic and Shane. Yeah, I just found that to be an interesting parallel.
Yeah, I suspect it has something to do with the way in which a certain kind of intellectual style makes all of those things appealing. But I'm not sure.
Well, with that being said, thank you, Gary, for coming on. Hope to have you on again in the future.
That would be a pleasure, and I thank you for hosting me today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Okay.
And I want to thank you all for tuning in to the Nate the Voluntarist live stream, and please come back soon.